Chapter 21. There was a great stir in the milkhouse just after break-fast. The churn revolved as usual, but the butter would not come. Whenever this happened, the dairy was paralyzed. Squish, squash echoed the milk in the great cylinder, but never arose the sound they waited for. Dairyman Crick and his wife, the milkmaids Tess, Mar Ian, Reddy Priddle, Is Hoot, and the married ones from the cottages, also Mr. Clare, Jonathan Kyle, old Deborah, and the rest, stood gazing hopelessly at the churn, and the boy who kept the horse going outside put on moon-like eyes to show his sense of the situation. Even the melancholy horse himself seemed to look in at the window in inquiring despair at each walk-round. "'Tis years since I went to Conjurer Trendle's son in Egdon, years," said the dairyman bitterly. And he was nothing to what his father had been. "I have said 50 times, if I have said once, that I don't believe in N. Though, do cast folks' waters very true. But I shall have to go to N if he's alive. Oh yes, I shall have to go to N, if this sort of thing continues." Even Mr. Clare began to feel tragical at the dairyman's desperation. "Conjurer Fall, t'other side of Casterbridge, that they used to call Wide O, was a very good man when I was a boy," said Jonathan Kyle. "But he's rotten as touchwood by now. My grandfather used to go to Conjurer Minturn, out at Owlscombe, and a clever man were, so I've heard grandfair say," continued Mr. Crick. "But there's no such genuine folk about nowadays." Mrs. Crick's mind kept nearer to the matter in hand. "Perhaps somebody in the house is in love," she said tentatively. "I've heard tell in my younger days that that will cause it." "Why, Crick, that maid we had years ago, do ye mind, and how the butter didn't come then?" "Ah yes, yes, but that isn't the right sort. It had nothing to do with the love-making. I can mind all about it. 'Twas the damage to the churn." He turned to Clare. "Jack Dollop, a whore's bird of a fellow we had here as milker at one time, sir, courted a young woman over at Mellstock, and deceived her as he had deceived many afore. But he had another sort o' woman to reckon why, this time, and it was not the girl herself. One holy Thursday of all days in the almanac, we was here as we mid be now, only there was no churning in hand, when we zid the girl's mother coming up to the door, why, a great brass-mounted umbrella in her hand that would ha felled an ox, and saying, 'Do Jack Dollop work here? Because I want him. I have a big bone to pick with he, I can assure en.' And some way behind her mother walked Jack's young woman, crying bitterly into her handkercher. 'Oh Lord, here's a time,' said Jack, looking out o' winder at him. 'She'll murder me. Where shall I get? Where shall I? Don't tell her where I be.' And with that he scrambled into the churn through the trap door, and shut himself inside, just as the young woman's mother busted into the milkhouse. 'The villain, where is he?' says she. 'I'll claw his face for en, let me only catch him.' Well, she hunted about everywhere, ballyragging Jack by side and by seam, Jack lying almost stifled inside the churn, and the poor maid, or young woman rather, standing at the door crying her eyes out. I shall never forget it, never. 'Twould have melted a marble stone. But she couldn't find him nowhere at all." The dairyman paused, and one or two words of comment came from the listeners. Dairyman Crick's stories often seemed to be ended when they were not really so, and strangers were betrayed into premature interjections of finality, though old friends knew better. The narrator went on, "Well, how the old woman should have had the wit to guess it I could never tell, but she found out that he was inside that there churn. Without saying a word she took hold of the winch, it was turned by hand power then, and round she swung him, and Jack began to flop about inside. 'Oh Lord, stop the churn, let me out,' says he, popping out his head. 'I shall be churned into a pumma.' He was a cow-ardly chap in his heart, as such men mostly be. 'Not till ye make amends for ravaging her virgin innocence,' says the old woman. 'Stop the churn, you old witch,' screams he. "You call me old witch, do ye, you deceiver?" says she, "when ye ought to ha' been calling me mother-law these last 5 months." And on went the churn, and Jack's bones rattled round again. Well, none of us ventured to interfere, and at last, a promised to make it right. Why, her. "Yes, I'll be as good as my word," he said. And so it ended that day. While the listeners were smiling their comments, there was a quick movement behind their backs, and they looked round. Tess, pale-faced, had gone to the door. "How warm 'tis today," she said, almost inaudibly. It was warm, and none of them connected her withdrawal with the reminiscences of the dairyman. He went forward and opened the door for her, saying with tender raillery, "Why, matey," he frequently, with unconscious irony, gave her this pet name, "the prettiest milker I've got in my dairy. You mustn't get so fagged as this at the first breath of summer weather, or we shall be finely put to for want of by dog days, shan't we, Mr. Clare?" I was faint, and "I think I am better out o' doors," she said mechanically, and disappeared outside. Fortunately for her, the milk in the revolving churn at that moment changed its squashing for a decided flick-flack. "'Tis coming," cried Mrs. Crick, and the attention of all was called off from Tess. That fair sufferer soon recovered herself externally, but she remained much depressed all the afternoon. When the evening milking was done, she did not care to be with the rest of them, and went out of doors, wandering along she knew not whither. She was wretched. Oh, so wretched, at the perception that to her companions the dairyman's story had been rather a humorous narration than otherwise. None of them but herself seemed to see the sorrow of it. To a certainty, not one knew how cruelly it touched the tender place in her experience. The evening sun was now ugly to her, like a great inflamed wound in the sky. Only a solitary cracked-voiced reed sparrow greeted her from the bushes by the river, in a sad, machine-made tone, resembling that of a past friend whose friendship she had outworn. In these long June days the milkmaids, and, indeed, most of the household, went to bed at sunset or sooner, the morning work before milking being so early and heavy at a time of full pails. Tess usually accompanied her fellows upstairs. Tonight, however, she was the first to go to their common chamber, and she had dozed when the other girls came in. She saw them undressing in the orange light of the vanished sun, which flushed their forms with its color. She dozed again, but she was reawakened by their voices, and quietly turned her eyes towards them. Neither of her 3 chamber companions had got into bed. They were standing in a group, in their nightgowns, barefooted, at the window, the last red rays of the west still warming their faces and necks and the walls around them. All were watching somebody in the garden with deep interest, their 3 faces close together, a jovial and round one, a pale one with dark hair, and a fair one whose tresses were auburn. "Don't push. You can see as well as I," said Reddy, the auburn-haired and youngest girl, without removing her eyes from the window. "'Tis no use for you to be in love with him any more than me, Reddy Priddle," said jolly-faced Marion, the eldest, slyly. "His thoughts be of other cheeks than thine." Reddy Priddle still looked, and the others looked again. "There he is again!" cried Ishoot, the pale girl with dark damp hair and keenly cut lips. "You needn't say anything, answered Reddy, "for I zid you kissing his shade." "What did you see her doing?" asked Marion. "Why, he was standing over the whey tub to let off the whey, and the shade of his face came upon the wall behind, close to who was standing there filling a vat. She put her mouth against the wall and kissed the shade of his mouth. I zid her, though he didn't." "Oh, Ishoot," said Marion. A rosy spot came into the middle of Ishoot's cheek. "Well, there was no harm in it," she declared, with attempted coolness. "And if I be in love whying, so is Reddy, too, and so be you, Marion, come to that." Marion's full face could not blush past its chronic pinkness. "Aye," she said, "what a tale. Ah, there he is again. Dear eyes, dear face, dear Mr. Clare. There, you've owned it. So have you, so have we all," said Marion, with the dry frankness of complete indifference to opinion. "It is silly to pretend otherwise amongst ourselves, though we need not own it to other folks." I would just marry in tomorrow. So would I, and more, murmured Ishoot. And I too, whispered the more timid Reddy. The listener grew warm. We can't all marry him, said Is. We shan't, either of us, which is worse still, said the eldest. There he is again. They all three blew him a silent kiss. Why? Asked Reddy quickly. Because he likes Tess Durbeyfield best, said Marion, lowering her voice. I have watched him every day, and have found it out. There was a reflective silence. But she don't care anything for him? At length breathed Reddy. Well, I sometimes think that too. But how silly all this is, said Ishoot impatiently. Of course he won't marry any one of us, or Tess either, a gentleman's son, who's going to be a great landowner and farmer abroad. More likely to ask us to come whine as farmhands at so much a year. One sighed, and another sighed, and Marion's plump figure sighed biggest of all. Somebody in bed hard by sighed too. Tears came into the eyes of Reddy Priddle, the pretty red-haired youngest, the last bud of the Paradels, so I am important in the county annals. They watched silently a little longer, their three faces still close together as before, and the triple hues of their hair mingling. But the unconscious Mr. Clare had gone indoors, and they saw him no more, and, the shades beginning to deepen, they crept into their beds. In a few minutes they heard him ascend the ladder to his own room. Marion was soon snoring, but Is did not drop into forgetfulness for a long time. Reddy Priddle cried herself to sleep. The deeper passioned Tess was very far from sleeping even then. This conversation was another of the bitter pills she had been obliged to swallow that day. Scarce the least feeling of jealousy arose in her breast. For that matter she knew herself to have the preference. Being more finely formed, better educated, and, though the youngest except Reddy, more woman than either, she perceived that only the slightest ordinary care was necessary for holding her own in Angel Clare's heart against these her candid friends. But the grave question was, ought she to do this? There was, to be sure, hardly a ghost of a chance for either of them, in a serious sense, but there was, or had been, a chance of one or the other inspiring him with a passing fancy for her, and enjoying the pleasure of his attentions while he stayed here. Such unequal attachments had led to marriage, and she had heard from Mrs. Crick that Mr. Clare had one day asked, in a laughing way, what would be the use of his marrying a fine lady, and all the while 10,000 acres of colonial pasture to feed, and cattle to rear, and corn to reap. A farm woman would be the only sensible kind of wife for him. But whether Mr. Clare had spoken seriously or not, why should she, who could never conscientiously allow any man to marry her now, and who had religiously determined that she never would be tempted to do so, draw off Mr. Clare's attention from other women, for the brief happiness of sunning herself in his eyes while he remained at Talbothays? Chapter 22. They came downstairs yawning next morning, but skimming and milking were proceeded with as usual, and they went indoors to breakfast. Dairyman Crick was discovered stamping about the house. He had received a letter, in which a customer had complained that the butter had a twang. And begad, so 't have, said the dairyman, who held in his left hand a wooden slice on which a lump of butter was stuck. Yes, taste for yourself. Several of them gathered round him, and Mr. Clare tasked Ed. Tess tasted, also the other indoor milkmaids, one or two of the milking men, and last of all Mrs. Crick, who came out from the waiting breakfast table. There certainly was a twang. The dairyman, who had thrown himself into abstraction to better realize the taste, and so divine the particular species of noxious weed to which it appertained, suddenly exclaimed, "'Tis garlic. And I thought there wasn't a blade left in that mead." Then all the old hands remembered that a certain dry mead, into which a few of the cows had been admitted of late, had, in years gone by, spoilt the butter in the same way. The dairyman had not recognized the taste at that time, and thought the butter bewitched. "We must overhaul that mead," he resumed, "this mustn't continue." All having armed themselves with old pointed knives, they went out together. As the inimical plant could only be present in very microscopic dimensions to have escaped ordinary observation, to find it seemed rather a hopeless attempt in the stretch of rich grass before them. However, they formed themselves into line, all assisting, owing to the importance of the search, the dairyman at the upper end with Mr. Clare, who had volunteered to help, then Tess, Marion, Ishoot, and Reddy, then Bill Lewell, Jonathan, and the married dairywoman, Beck Nibbs, with her woolly black hair and rolling eyes, and flaxen Francis, consumptive from the winter damps of the water meads, who lived in their respective cottages. With eyes fixed upon the ground they crept slowly across a strip of the field, returning a little further down in such a manner that, when they should have finished, not a single inch of the pasture but would have fallen under the eye of some one of them. It was a most tedious business, not more than half a dozen shoots of garlic being discoverable in the whole field. Yet such was the herb's pungency that probably one bite of it by one cow had been sufficient to season the whole dairy's produce for the day. Differing one from another in natures and moods so greatly as they did, they yet formed, bending, a curiously uniform row, automatic, noiseless, and an alien observer passing down the neighboring lane might well have been excused for massing them as Hodge. As they crept along, stooping low to discern the plant, a soft yellow gleam was reflected from the buttercups into their shaded faces, giving them an elfish, moonlit aspect, though the sun was pouring upon their backs in all the strength of noon. Angel Clare, who communistically stuck to his rule of taking part with the rest in everything, glanced up now and then. It was not, of course, by accident that he walked next to Tess. "Well, how are you?" he murmured. "Very well, thank you, sir," she replied demurely. As they had been discussing a score of personal matters only half an hour before, the introductory style seemed a little superfluous. But they got no further in speech just then. They crept and crept, the hem of her petticoat just touching his gaiter and his elbows sometimes brushing hers. At last the dairyman, who came next, could stand it no longer. "Upon my soul and body, this here stooping do fairly make my back open and shut," he exclaimed, straightening himself slowly with an excruciated look till quite upright. "And you, matey Tess, you wasn't well a day or two ago. This will make your head ache finely. Don't do any more, if you feel fainty, leave the rest to finish it." Dairyman Crick withdrew, and Tess dropped behind. Mr. Clare also stepped out of line, and began privateering about for the weed. When she found him near her, her very tension at what she had heard the night before made her the first to speak. "Don't they look pretty?" she said. "Who? Izzy Hoot and Reddy." Tess had moodily decided that either of these maidens would make a good farmer's wife, and that she ought to recommend them, and obscure her own wretched charms. "Pretty? Well, yes, they are pretty girls, fresh-looking. I have often thought so. Though, poor dears, prettiness won't last long. Oh no, unfortunately. They are excellent dairywomen. Yes. Though not better than you. They skim better than I, do they?" Clare remained observing them, not without their obes serving him. "She is coloring up," continued Tess heroically. "Who? Reddy Priddle. Oh, why at that? Because you are looking at her." Self-sacrificing as her mood might be, Tess could not well go further and cry, "Marry one of them, if you really do want a dairywoman and not a lady. And don't think of marrying me." She followed Dairyman Crick, and had the mournful satisfaction of seeing that Clare remained behind. From this day she forced herself to take pains to avoid him, never allowing herself, as formerly, to remain long in his company, even if their juxtaposition were purely accidental. She gave the other three every chance. Tess was woman enough to realize from their avowals to herself that Angel Clare had the honor of all the dairymaids in his keeping, and her perception of his care to avoid compromising the happiness of either in the least degree bred a tender respect in Tess for what she deemed, rightly or wrongly, the self-controlling sense of duty shown by him, a quality which she had never expected to find in one of the opposite sex, and in the absence of which more than one of the simple hearts who were his housemates might have gone weeping on her pilgrimage. Chapter 23. The hot weather of July had crept upon them unawares, and the atmosphere of the flat vale hung heavy as an opiate over the dairy folk, the cows, and the trees. Hot steaming rains fell frequently, making the grass where the cows fed yet more rank, and hindering the late hay making in the other meads. It was Sunday morning, the milking was done, the outdoor milkers had gone home. Tess and the other three were dressing themselves rapidly, the whole bevy having agreed to go together to Mellstock Church, which lay some 3 or 4 miles distant from the dairy house. She had now been 2 months at Talbothays, and this was her first excursion. All the preceding afternoon and night heavy thunderstorms had hissed down upon the meads, and washed some of the hay into the river, But this morning the sun shone out all the more brilliantly for the deluge, and the air was balmy and clear. The crooked lane leading from their own parish to Mellstock ran along the lowest levels in a portion of its length, and when the girls reached the most depressed spot they found that the result of the rain had been to flood the lane over shoe to a distance of some 50 yards. This would have been no serious hindrance on a weekday. They would have clicked through it in their high pattens and boots quite unconcerned. But on this day of vanity, this sun's day, when flesh went forth to coquette with flesh while hypocritically affecting business with spiritual things, on this occasion for wearing their white stockings and thin shoes, and their pink, white, and lilac gowns, on which every mud spot would be visible, the pool was an awkward impediment. They could hear the church bell calling, as yet nearly a mile off. "Who would have expected such a rise in the river in summertime?" said Marion, from the top of the roadside bank on which they had climbed, and were maintaining a precarious footing in the hope of creeping along its slope till they were past the pool. "We can't get there anyhow, without walking right through it, or else going round the turnpike way. And that would make us so very late," said Reddy, pausing hopelessly. "And I do color up so hot, walking into church late, and all the people staring round," said Marion, "that I hardly cool down again till we get into the that it may please these." While they stood clinging to the bank they heard a splashing round the bend of the road, and presently a pea-paired Angel Clare, advancing along the lane towards them through the water. 4 hearts gave a big throb simultaneously. His aspect was probably as un-Sabbatarian a one as a dogmatic parson's son often presented, his attire being his dairy clothes, long wading boots, a cabbage leaf inside his hat to keep his head cool, with a thistle spud to finish him off. "He's not going to church," said Marion. "No, I wish he was," murmured Tess. Angel, in fact, rightly or wrongly, to adopt the safe phrase of evasive controversialists, preferred sermons in stones to sermons in churches and chapels on fine summer days. This morning, moreover, he had gone out to see if the damage to the hay by the flood was considerable or not. On his walk he observed the girls from a long distance, though they had been so occupied with their difficulties of passage as not to notice him. He knew that the water had risen at that spot, and that it would quite check their progress. So he had hastened on, with a dim idea of how he could help them, one of them in particular. The rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed quartet looked so charming in their light summer attire, clinging to the roadside bank like pigeons on a roof slope, that he stopped a moment to regard them before coming close. Their gauzy skirts had brushed up from the grass innumerable flies and butterflies which, unable to escape, remained caged in the transparent tissue as in an aviary. Angel's eye at last fell upon Tess, the hindmost of the 4. She, being full of suppressed laughter at their dilemma, could not help meeting his glance radiantly. He came beneath them in the water, which did not rise over his long boots, and stood looking at the entrapped flies and butterflies. "Are you trying to get to church?" he said to Marion, who was in front, including the next 2 in his remark, but avoiding Tess. "Yes, sir, and 'tis getting late, and my color do come up so. I'll carry you through the pool, every gill of you." The whole 4 flushed as if one heart beat through them. "I think you can't, sir," said Marion. "It is the only way for you to get past. Stand still." "Nonsense, you are not too heavy. I'd carry you all 4 together. Now, Marion, attend," he continued, "and put your arms round my shoulders, so. Now, hold on. That's well done." Marion had lowered herself upon his arm and shoulder as directed, and Angel strode off with her, his slim figure, as viewed from behind, looking like the mere stem to the great nosegay suggested by hers. They disappeared round the curve of the road, and only his sousing footsteps and the top ribbon of Marion's bonnet told where they were. In a few minutes he reappeared. Is Hoot was the next in hors d'oeuvre upon the bank. "Here he comes," she murmured, and they could hear that her lips were dry with emotion. "And I have to put my arms round his neck and look into his face as Marion did." "There's nothing in that," said Tess quickly. "There's a time for everything," continued Is, unheeding. "A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. the first is now going to be mine. Fie, it is scripture, is. Yes, said Is, I've always a ear at church for pretty verses. Angel Claire, to whom 3/4 of this performance was a commonplace act of kindness, now approached Is. She quietly and dreamily lowered herself into his arms, and Angel methodically marched off with her. When he was heard returning for the third time, Reddy's throbbing heart could be almost seen to shake her. He went up to the red-haired girl, and while he was seizing her he glanced at Tess. His lips could not have pronounced more plainly, "It will soon be you and I." Her comprehension appeared in her face. She could not help it. There was an understanding between them. Poor little Reddy, though by far the lightest weight, was the most troublesome of Claire's burdens. Marion had been like a sack of meal, a dead weight of plumpness under which he has literally staggered. Is had ridden sensibly and calmly. Reddy was a bunch of hysterics. However, he got through with the disquieted creature, deposited her, and returned. Tess could see over the hedge the distant three in a group, standing as he had placed them on the next rising ground. It was now her turn. She was embarrassed to discover that excitement at the proximity of Mr. Clare's breath and eyes, which she had contemned in her companions, was intensified in herself, and as if fearful of betraying her secret, she paltered with him at the last moment. "I may be able to climb along the bank perhaps, I can climb better than they." "You must be so tired, Mr. Clare." "No, no, Tess," said he quickly. And almost before she was aware, she was seated in his arms and resting against his shoulder. "3 Leahs to get 1 Rachel," he whispered. "They are better women than I," she replied, magnanimously sticking to her resolve. "Not to me," said Angel. He saw her grow warm at this, and they went some steps in silence. "I hope I am not too heavy," she said timidly. "Oh no, you should lift Marion, such a lump. You are like an undulating billow warmed by the sun. And all this fluff of muslin about you is the froth. It is very pretty, if I seem like that to you. Do you know that I have undergone 3/4 of this labor entirely for the sake of the 4th quarter? No, I did not expect such an event today. Nor I. The water came up so sudden. That the rise in the water was what she understood him to refer to, the state of breathing belied." Claire stood still and inclinced his face towards hers. "Oh Tessie," he exclaimed. The girl's cheeks burned to the breeze, and she could not look into his eyes for her emotion. It reminded Angel that he was somewhat unfairly taking advantage of an accidental position, and he went no further with it. No definite words of love had crossed their lips as yet, and suspension at this point was desirable now. However, he walked slowly, to make the remainder of the distance as long as possible, but at last they came to the bend, and the rest of their progress was in full view of the other 3. The dry land was reached, and he set her down. Her friends were looking with round thoughtful eyes at her and him, and she could see that they had been talking of her. He hastily bade them farewell, and splashed back along the stretch of submerged road. The 4 moved on together as before, till Marion broke the silence by saying, "No, in all truth. We have no chance against her." She looked joylessly at Tess. "What do you mean?" asked the latter. "He likes E.E. best, the very best. We could see it as he brought E.E. He would have kissed E.E. if you had encouraged him to do it, ever so little." "No, no," said she. The gaiety with which they had set out had somehow vanished. And yet there was no enmity or malice between them. They were generous young souls. They had been reared in the lonely country nooks where fatalism is a strong sentiment, and they did not blame her. Such supplanting was to be. Tess's heart ached. There was no concealing from herself the fact that she loved Angel Clare, perhaps all the more passionately from knowing that the others had also lost their hearts to him. There is contagion in this sentiment, especially among women. And yet that same hungry nature had fought against this, but too feebly, and the natural result had followed. "I will never stand in your way, nor in the way of either of you," she declared to Reddy that night in the bedroom, her tears running down. "I can't help this, my dear. I don't think marrying is in his mind at all, but if he were ever to ask me I should refuse him, as I should refuse any man." "Oh, would you? Why?" said wondering Reddy. "It cannot be. But I will be plain. Putting myself quite on one side, I don't think he will choose either of you." "I have never expected it, thought of it," moaned Reddy. "But oh, I wish I was dead." The poor child, torn by a feeling which she hardly understood, turned to the other two girls who came upstairs just then. "We be friends with her again," she said to them. "She thinks no more of his choosing her than we do." So the reserve went off, and they were confiding and warm. "I don't seem to care what I do now," said Marion, whose mood was turned to its lowest base. "I was going to marry a dairyman at Stickleford, who's asked me twice, but, my soul, I would put an end to myself rather 'n be his wife now." "Why don't ye speak, Is?" "To confess, then," murmured Is, "I made sure today that he was going to kiss me as he held me, and I lay still against his breast, hoping, and never moved at all. But he did not. I don't like biding here at Talbothays any longer. I shall go home." The air of the sleeping chamber seemed to palpitate with the hopeless passion of the girls. They writhed feverishly under the oppressiveness of an emotion thrust on them by cruel nature's law, an emotion which they had neither expected nor desired. The incident of the day had fanned the flame that was burning the inside of their hearts out, and the torture was almost more than they could endure. The differences which distinguished them as individuals were abstracted by this passion, and each was but portion of one organism called sex. There was so much frankness and so little jealousy because there was no hope. Each one was a girl of fair common sense, and she did not delude herself with any vain conceits, or deny her love, or give herself airs, in the idea of outshining the others. The full recognition of the futility of their infatuation, from a social point of view, its purposeless beginning, its self-bounded outlook, its lack of everything to justify its existence in the eye of civilization, while lacking nothing in the eye of nature, the one fact that it did exist, ecstasizing them to a killing joy. All this imparted to them a resignation, a dignity, which a practical and sordid expectation of winning him as a husband would have destroyed. They tossed and turned on their little beds, and the cheese ring dripped monotonously downstairs. "Be you awake, Tess?" whispered one, half an hour later. It was Hoot's voice. Tess replied in the affirmative, whereupon also Reddy and Marion suddenly flung the bedclothes off them, and sighed, "So be we. I wonder what she is like, the lady they say his family have looked out for him." "I wonder," said Is. "Some lady looked out for him?" gasped Tess, starting. "I have never heard o' that." "Oh yes, 'tis whispered. A young lady of his own rank, chosen by his family, a doctor of divinity's daughter near his father's parish of Emminster. He don't much care for her, they say. But he is sure to marry her." They had heard so very little of this, yet it was enough to build up wretched dolorous dreams upon, there in the shade of the night. They pictured all the details of his being won round to consent, of the wedding preparations, of the bride's happiness, of her dress and veil, of her blissful home with him, when oblivion would have fallen upon themselves as far as he and their love were concerned. Thus they talked, and ached, and wept till sleep charmed their sorrow away. After this disclosure Tess nourished no further foolish thought that there lurked any grave and deliberate import in Claire's attentions to her. It was a passing summer love of her face, for love's own temporary sake, nothing more. And the thorny crown of this sad conception was that she whom he really did prefer in a cursory way to the rest, she who knew herself to be more impassioned in nature, cleverer, more beautiful than they, was in the eyes of propriety far less worthy of him than the homelier ones whom he ignored. Chapter 24. Amid the oozing fatness and warm ferments of the Froom Vale, at a season when the rush of juices could almost be heard below the hiss of fertilization, it was impossible that the most fanciful love should not grow passionate. The ready bosoms existing there were impregnated by their surroundings. July passed over their heads, and the Thermidorian weather which came in its wake seemed an effort on the part of nature to match the state of hearts at Talbothays Dairy. The air of the place, so fresh in the spring and early summer, was stagnant and enervating now. Its heavy scents weighed upon them, and at midday the landscape seemed lying in a swoon. Ethiopic scorchings browned the upper slopes of the pastures, but there was still bright green herbage here where the watercourses purled. And as Claire was oppressed by the outward heats, so was he burdened inwardly by waxing fair ver of passion for the soft and silent Tess. The rains having passed, the uplands were dry. The wheels of the dairyman's spring cart, as he sped home from market, licked up the pulverized surface of the highway, and were followed by white ribbons of dust, as if they had set a thin powder train on fire. The cows jumped wildly over the 5-barred Barton gate, maddened by the gad fly. Dairyman Crick kept his shirt sleeves permanently rolled up from Monday to Saturday. Open windows had no effect in ventilation without open doors, and in the dairy garden the blackbirds and thrushes crept about under the currant bushes, rather in the manner of quadrupeds than of winged creatures. The flies in the kitchen were lazy, teasing, and familiar, crawling about in the unwanted places, on the floors, into drawers, and over the backs of the milkmaids' hands. Conversations were concerning sunstroke, while butter-making, and still more butter-keeping, was a despair. They milked entirely in the meads for coolness and convenience, without driving in the cows. During the day the animals obsequiously followed the shadow of the smallest tree as it moved round the stem with the diurnal roll, and when the milkers came they could hardly stand still for the flies. On one of these afternoons 4 or 5 unmilked cows chanced to stand apart from the general herd, behind the corner of a hedge, among them being Dumpling and Old Pretty, who loved Tess's hands above those of any other maid. When she rose from her stool under a finished cow, Angel Clare, who had been observing her for some time, asked her if she would take the aforesaid creatures next. She silently assented, and with her stool at arm's length, and the pail against her knee, went round to where they stood. Soon the sound of Old Pretty's milk fizzing into the pail came through the hedge, and then Angel felt inclined to go round the corner also, to finish off a hard-yielding milcher who had strayed there, he being now as capable of this as the dairyman himself. All the men, and some of the women, when milking, dug their foreheads into the cows and gazed into the pail. But a few, mainly the younger ones, rested their heads sideways. This was Tess Durbeyfield's habit, her temple pressing the milcher's flank, her eyes fixed on the far end of the meadow with the quiet of one lost in meditation. She was milking Old Pretty thus, and the sun chancing to be on the milking side, it shone flat upon her pink-gowned form and her white curtain bonnet, and upon her profile, rendering it keen as a cameo cut from the dun background of the cow. She did not know that Clare had followed her round, and that he sat under his cow watching her. The stillness of her head and features was remarkable. She might have been in a trance, her eyes open, yet unseeing. Nothing in the picture moved but Old Pretty's tail and Tess's pink hands, the latter so gently as to be a rhythmic pulsation only, as if they were obeying a reflex stimulus, like a beating heart. How very lovable her face was to him. Yet there was no thing ethereal about it. All was real vitality, real warmth, real incarnation. And it was in her mouth that this culminated. Eyes almost as deep and speaking he had seen before, and cheeks perhaps as fair. Brows as arched, a chin and throat almost as shapely. Her mouth he had seen nothing to equal on the face of the earth. To a young man with the least fire in him that little upward lift in the middle of her red top lip was distracting, infatuating, maddening. He had never before seen a woman's lips and teeth which forced upon his mind with such persistent iteration the old Elizabethan simile of roses filled with snow. Perfect, he, as a lover, might have called them offhand. But no, they were not perfect. And it was the touch of the imperfect upon the would-be perfect that gave the sweetness, because it was that which gave the humanity. Clare had studied the curves of those lips so many times that he could reproduce them mentally with ease. And now, as they again confronted him, clothed with color and life, they sent an aura over his flesh, a breeze through his nerves, which well nigh produced a qualm, and actually produced, by some mysterious physiological process, a prosaic sneeze. She then became conscious that he was observing her, but she would not show it by any change of position, though the curious dream-like fixity disappeared, and a close eye might easily have discerned that the rosiness of her face deepened, and then faded till only a tinge of it was left. The influence that had passed into Clare like an excitation from the sky did not die down. Resolutions, reticences, prudences, fears, fell back like a defeated battalion. He jumped up from his seat, and, leaving his pail to be kicked over if the milcher had such a mind, went quickly towards the desire of his eyes, and, kneeling down beside her, clasped her in his arms. Tess was taken completely by surprise, and she yielded to his embrace with unreflecting inevitableness. Having seen that it was really her lover who had advanced, and no one else, her lips parted, and she sank upon him in her momentary joy, with something very like an ecstatic cry. He had been on the point of kissing that too tempting mouth, but he checked himself, for tender conscience sake. "Forgive me, Tess dear," he whispered. "I ought to have asked. I did not know what I was doing. I do not mean it as a liberty. I am devoted to you, Tessie, dearest, in all sincerity." Old Pretty by this time had looked round, puzzled, and seeing two people crouching under her where, by a memorial custom, there should have been only one, lifted her hind leg crossly. "She is angry, she doesn't know what we mean, she'll kick over the milk," exclaimed Tess, gently striving to free herself, her eyes concerned with the quadruped's actions, her heart more deeply concerned with herself and Claire. She slipped up from her seat, and they stood together, his arms still encircling her. Tess's eyes, fixed on distance, began to fill. "Why do you cry, my darling?" he said. "Oh, I don't know," she murmured. As she saw and felt more clearly the position she was in, she became agitated and tried to withdraw. "Well, I have betrayed my feeling, Tess, at last," said he, with a curious sigh of desperation, signifying unconsciously that his heart had outrun his judgment. "That I love you dearly and truly I need not say. But it shall go no further now, it distresses you, I am as surprised as you are. You will not think I have presumed upon your defenselessness, been too quick and unreflecting, will you? I can't tell." He had allowed her to free herself, and in a minute or two the milking of each was resumed. Nobody had beheld the gravitation of the two into one, and when the dairyman came round by that screened nook a few minutes later, there was not a sign to reveal that the markedly sundered pair were more to each other than mere acquaintance. Yet in the interval since Crick's last view of them something had occurred which changed the pivot of the universe for their two natures, something which, had he known its quality, the dairyman would have despised, as a practical man, yet which was based upon a more stubborn and resistless tendency than a whole heap of so-called practicalities. A veil had been whisked aside. The tract of each one's outlook was to have a new horizon thenceforward, for a short time or for a long. End of Phase the Third. Phase the Fourth. The Consequence. Chapter 25. Claire, restless, went out into the dusk when evening drew on, she who had won him having retired to her chambre. The night was as sultry as the day. There was no coolness after dark unless on the grass. Roads, garden paths, the house fronts, the barton walls were warm as hearths, and reflected the noontime temperature into the noctambulist's face. He sat on the east gate of the dairy yard, and knew not what to think of himself. Feeling had indeed smothered judgment that day. Since the sudden embrace, 3 hours before, the twain had kept apart. She seemed stilled, almost alarmed, at what had occurred, while the novelty, unpremeditation, mastery of circumstance disquieted him, palpitating, contemplative being that he was. He could hardly realize their true relations to each other as yet, and what their mutual bearing should be before third parties thenceforward. Angel had come as pupil to this dairy in the idea that his temporary existence here was to be the merest episode in his life, soon passed through and early forgotten. He had come as to a place from which as from a screened alcove he could calmly view the absorbing world without, and, apostrophizing it with Walt Whitman crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes, "How curious you are to me," resolve upon a plan for plunging into that world anew. But behold, the absorbing scene had been imported hither. What had been the engrossing world had dissolved into an uninteresting outer dumb show, while here, in this apparently dim and unimpassioned place, novelty had volcanically started up, as it had never, for him, started up elsewhere. Every window of the house being open, Claire could hear across the yard each trivial sound of the retiring household. The dairy house, so humble, so insignificant, so purely to him a place of constrained sojourn that he had never hitherto deemed it of sufficient importance to be reconnoitered as an object of any quality whatever in the landscape. What was it now? The aged and lichened brick gables breathed forth, "Stay." The windows smiled, the door coaxed and beckoned, the creeper blushed confederacy. A personality within it was so far-reaching in her influence as to spread into and make the bricks, mortar, and whole overhanging sky throb with a burning sensibility. Whose was this mighty personality? A milkmaid's. It was amazing, indeed, to find how great a matter the life of the obscure dairy had become to him. And though new love was to be held partly responsible for this, it was not solely so. Many besides Angel have learnt that the magnitude of lives is not as to their external displacements, but as to their subjective experiences. The impressionable peasant leads a larger, fuller, more dramatic life than the pachydermatous king. Looking at it thus, he found that life was to be seen of the same magnitude here as elsewhere. Despite his heterodoxy, faults, and weaknesses, Claire was a man with a conscience. Tess was no insignificant creature to toy with and dismiss, but a woman living her precious life, a life which, to herself who endured or enjoyed it, possessed as great a dimension as the life of the mightiest to himself. Upon her sensations the whole world depended to Tess. Through her existence all her fellow creatures existed, to her. The universe itself only came into being for Tess on the particular day in the particular year in which she was born. This consciousness upon which he had intruded was the single opportunity of existence ever vouchsafed to Tess by an unsympathetic first cause, her all, her every and only chance. How then should he look upon her as of less consequence than himself, as a pretty trifle to caress and grow weary of, and not deal in the greatest seriousness with the affection which he knew that he had awakened in her, so fervid and so impressionable as she was under her reserve, in order that it might not agonize and wreck her? To encounter her daily in the accustomed manner would be to develop what had begun. Living in such close relations, to meet meant to fall into endearment. Flesh and blood could not resist it. And, having arrived at no conclusion as to the issue of such a tendency, he decided to hold aloof for the present from occupations in which they would be mutually engaged. As yet the harm done was small. But it was not easy to carry out the resolution never to approach her. He was driven towards her by every heave of his pulse. He thought he would go and see his friends. It might be possible to sound them upon this. In less than 5 months his term here would have ended, and after a few additional months spent upon other farms he would be fully equipped in agricultural knowledge and in a position to start on his own account. Would not a farmer want a wife, and should a farmer's wife be a drawing-room wax figure, or a woman who understood farming? Notwithstanding the pleasing answer returned to him by the silence, he resolved to go his journey. One morning when they sat down to breakfast at Tall Bothay's dairy some maid observed that she had not seen anything of Mr. Clare that day. "Oh no," said Dairyman Crick. "Mr. Clare has gone home to Emminster to spend a few days wi' his kinsfolk." For 4 impassioned ones around that table the sunshine of the morning went out at a stroke, and the birds muffled their song. But neither girl by word or gesture revealed her blankness. "He's getting on towards the end of his time me," added the dairyman, with a phlegm which unconsciously was brutal. "And so I suppose he is beginning to see about his plans elsewhere." "How much longer is he to bide here?" asked Ishoot, the only one of the gloom-stricken bevy who could trust her voice with the question. The others waited for the dairyman's answer as if their lives hung upon it. Ready, with parted lips, gazing on the tablecloth, Marion with heat added to her redness, Tess throbbing and looking out at the meads. "Well, I can't mind the exact day without looking at my memorandum book," replied Crick, with the same intolerable unconcern. "And even that may be altered a bit. He'll bide to get a little practice in the calving out at the straw yard, for certain." He'll hang on till the end of the year, I should say. 4 months or so of torturing ecstasy in his society, of pleasure girdled about with pain. After that, the blackness of unutterable night. At this moment of the morning, Angel Clare was riding along a narrow lane 10 miles distant from the breakfasters, in the direction of his father's vicarage at Emminster, carrying, as well as he could, a little basket which contained some black puddings and a bottle of mead, sent by Mrs. Crick, with her kind respects, to his parents. The white lane stretched before him, and his eyes were upon it, but they were staring into next year, and not at the lane. He loved her. Ought he to marry her? Dared he to marry her? What would his mother and his brothers say? What would he himself say a couple of years after the event? That would depend upon whether the germs of staunch comradeship underlay the temporary emotion, or whether it were a sensuous joy in her form only, with no substratum of everlastingness. His father's hill surrounded little town, the Tudor church tower of red stone, the clump of trees near the vicarage, came at last into view beneath him, and he rode down towards the well-known gate. Casting a glance in the direction of the church before entering his home, he beheld standing by the vestry door a group of girls, of ages between 12 and 16, apparently awaiting the arrival of some other one, who in a moment became visible. A figure somewhat older than the schoolgirls, wearing a broad-brimmed hat and highly starched cambric morning gown, with a couple of books in her hand. Clare knew her well. He could not be sure that she observed him. He hoped she did not, so as to render it unnecessary that he should go and speak to her, blameless creature that she was. An overpowering reluctance to greet her made him decide that she had not seen him. The young lady was Miss Mercy Chant, the only daughter of his father's neighbor and friend, whom it was his parents' quiet hope that he might wed some day. She was great at antinomianism and Bible classes, and was plainly going to hold a class now. Clare's mind flew to the impassioned, summer-steeped heathens in the Var Vale, their rosy faces court-patched with cow droppings, and to one the most impassioned of them all. It was on the impulse of the moment that he had resolved to trot over to Emminster, and hence had not written to apprise his mother and father, aiming, however, to arrive about the breakfast hour, before they should have gone out to their parish duties. He was a little late, and they had already sat down to the morning meal. The group at the table jumped up to welcome him as soon as he entered. They were his father and mother, his brother the Reverend Felix, curate at a town in the adjoining county, home for the inside of a fortnight, and his other brother, the Reverend Cuthbert, the classical scholar, and fellow and dean of his college, down from Cambridge for the long vacation. His mother appeared in a cap and silver spectacles, and his father looked what in fact he was, an earnest, God-fearing man, somewhat gaunt, in years about 65, his pale face lined with thought and purpose. Over their heads hung the picture of Angel's sister, the eldest of the family, 16 years his senior, who had married a missionary and gone out to Africa. Old Mr. Clare was a clergyman of a type which, within the last 20 years, has well nigh dropped out of contemporary life. A spiritual descendant in the direct line from Wycliffe, Huss, Luther, Calvin, an evangelical of the evangelicals, a conversionist, a man of apostolic simplicity in life and thought, he had in his raw youth made up his mind once for all in the deeper questions of existence, and admitted no further reasoning on them thenceforward. He was regarded even by those of his own date and school of thinking as extreme, while, on the other hand, those totally opposed to him were unwillingly won to admiration for his thoroughness, and for the remarkable power he showed in dismissing all question as to principles in his energy for applying them. He loved Paul of Tarsus, liked St. John, hated St. James as much as he dared, and regarded with mixed feelings Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. The New Testament was less a Christiad than a Polyad to his intelligence, less an argument than an intoxication. His creed of determinism was such that it almost amounted to a vice, and quite amounted, on its negative side, to a renunciative philosophy which had cousinship with that of Schopenhauer and Leopardi. He despised the canons and rubric, swore by the articles, and deemed himself consistent through the whole category, which in a way he might have been. One thing he certainly was, sincere. To the aesthetic, sensuous, pagan pleasure in natural life and lush womanhood which his son Angel had lately been experiencing in Var Vale, his temper would have been antipathetic in a high degree, had he either by inquiry or imagination been able to apprehend it. Once upon a time Angel had been so unlucky as to say to his father, in a moment of irritation, that it might have resulted far better for mankind if Greece had been the source of the religion of modern civilization, and not Palestine, and his father's grief was of that blank description which could not realize that there might lurk a thousandth part of a truth, much less a half-truth or a whole truth, in such a proposition. He had simply preached austerely at Angel for some time after. But the kindness of his heart was such that he never resented anything for long, and welcomed his son today with a smile which was as candidly sweet as a child's. Angel sat down, and the place felt like home, yet he did not so much as formerly feel himself one of the family gathered there. Every time that he returned hither he was conscious of this divergence, and since he had last shared in the vicarage life it had grown even more distinctly foreign to his own than usual. Its transcendental aspirations, still unconsciously based on the geocentric view of things, a zenithal paradise, a nadiral hell, were as foreign to his own as if they had been the dreams of people on another planet. Latterly he had seen only life, felt only the great passionate pulse of existence, unwarped, uncontorted, untrammeled by those creeds which futilely attempt to check what wisdom would be content to regulate. On their part they saw a great difference in him, a growing divergence from the Angel Clare of former times. It was chiefly a difference in his manner that they noticed just now, particularly his brothers. He was getting to behave like a farmer. He flung his legs about. The muscles of his face had grown more expressive. His eyes looked as much information as his tongue spoke, and more. The manner of the scholar had nearly disappeared. Still more the manner of the drawing-room young man. A prig would have said that he had lost culture, and a prude that he had become coarse. Such was the contagion of domiciliary fellowship with the Talbothays nymphs and swains. After breakfast he walked with his two brothers, non-evangelical, well-educated, hall-marked young men, correct to their remotest fiber, such unimpeachable models as are turned out yearly by the lathe of a systematic tuition. They were both somewhat short-sighted, and when it was the custom to wear a single eyeglass and string they wore a single eyeglass and string. When it was the custom to wear a double glass they wore a double glass. When it was the custom to wear spectacles they wore spectacles straightway, all without reference to the particular variety of defect in their own vision. When Wordsworth was enthroned they carried pocket copies, and when Shelley was belittled they allowed him to grow dusty on their shelves. When Correggio's Holy Families were admired, they admired Correggio's Holy Families. When he was decried in favor of Velázquez, they sedulously followed suit without any personal objection. If these two noticed Angel's growing social ineptness, he noticed their growing mental limitations. Felix seemed to him all church, Cuthbert all college. His diocesan synod and visitations were the mainsprings of the world to the one, Cambridge to the other. Each brother candidly recognized that there were a few unimportant score of millions of outsiders in civilized society, persons who were neither university men nor churchmen, but they were to be tolerated rather than reckoned with and respected. They were both dutiful and attentive sons, and were regular in their visits to their parents. Felix, though an offshoot from a far more recent point in the devolution of theology than his father, was less self-sacrificing and disinterested. More tolerant than his father of a contradictory opinion, in its aspect as a danger to its holder, he was less ready than his father to pardon it as a slight to his own teaching. Cuthbert was, upon the whole, the more liberal-minded, though, with greater subtlety, he had not so much heart. As they walked along the hillside, Angel's former feeling revived in him, that whatever their advantages by comparison with himself, neither saw or set forth life as it really was lived. Perhaps, as with many men, their opportunities of observation were not so good as their opportunities of expression. Neither had an adequate conception of the complicated forces at work outside the smooth and gentle current in which they and their associates floated. Neither saw the difference between local truth and universal truth, that what the inner world said in their clerical and academic hearing was quite a different thing from what the outer world was thinking. "I suppose it is farming or nothing for you now, my dear fellow," Felix was saying, among other things, to his youngest brother, as he looked through his spectacles at the distant fields with sad austerity. "And, therefore, we must make the best of it. But I do entreat you to endeavor to keep as much as possible in touch with moral ideals. Farming, of course, means roughing it externally, but high thinking may go with plain living, nevertheless." "Of course it may," said Angel. "Was it not proved 1900 years ago, if I may trespass upon your domain a little? Why should you think, Felix, that I am likely to drop my high thinking and my moral ideals? Well, I fancied, from the tone of your letters and our conversation, it may be fancy only, that you were somehow losing intellectual grasp. Hasn't it struck you, Cuthbert? Now, Felix," said Angel dryly, "we are very good friends, you know, each of us treading our allotted circles, but if it comes to intellectual grasp, I think you, as a contented dogmatist, had better leave mine alone, and inquire what has become of yours." They returned down the hill to dinner, which was fixed at any time at which their father's and mother's morning work in the parish usually concluded. Convenience as regarded afternoon callers was the last thing to enter into the consideration of unselfish Mr. and Mrs. Clare, though the three sons were sufficiently in unison on this matter to wish that their parents would conform a little to modern notions. The walk had made them hungry, Angel in particular, who was now an outdoor man, accustomed to the profuse dates inempte of the dairyman's somewhat coarsely laden table. But neither of the old people had arrived, and it was not till the sons were almost tired of waiting that their parents entered. The self-denying pair had been occupied in coaxing the appetites of some of their sick parishioners, whom they, somewhat inconsistently, tried to keep impress-oned in the flesh, their own appetites being quite forgotten. The family sat down to table, and a frugal meal of cold viands was deposited before them. Angel looked round for Mrs. Crick's black puddings, which he had directed to be nicely grilled as they did them at the dairy, and of which he wished his father and mother to appreciate the marvelous herbal savors as highly as he did himself. "Ah, you are looking for the black puddings, my dear boy," observed Clare's mother. "But I am sure you will not mind doing without them, as I am sure your father and I shall not, when you know the reason. I suggested to him that we should take Mrs. Crick's kind present to the children of the man who can earn nothing just now because of his attacks of delirium tremens, and he agreed that it would be a great pleasure to them, so we did." "Of course," said Angel cheerfully, looking round for the mead. "I found the mead so extremely alcoholic," continued his mother, "that it was quite unfit for use as a beverage, but as valuable as rum or brandy in an emergency. So I have put it in my medicine closet. We never drink spirits at this table, on principle," added his father. "But what shall I tell the dairyman's wife?" said Angel. "The truth, of course," said his father. "I rather wanted to say we enjoyed the mead and the black puddings very much. She is a kind, jolly sort of body, and is sure to ask me directly I return." "You cannot, if we did not," Mr. Clare answered lucidly. "Ah, no, though that mead was a drop of pretty tipple." "A what?" said Cuthbert and Felix both. "Oh, 'tis an expression they use down at Talbothays," replied Angel, blushing. He felt that his parents were right in their practice if wrong in their want of sentiment, and said no more. See you again next video. Thank you.